All right, so we are, I believe, if I have my notes, going to finally finish up Daniel 11. Dun dun dun. Dramatic effect. So picking up at Daniel 11, chapter 20, verse 20. Now we're talking about these kingdoms. We all remember that, and I'll give you a little refresh. I'm not going to give you the full refresh, but essentially you had Alexander the Great's empire broke up into 4 kingdoms. The most powerful of those kingdoms were the northern Syrian kingdom and the southern Egyptian kingdom. They were constantly at war with each other over hundreds of years. And the kings of the north are the northern kingdom of Syria, kings of the south are the southern kingdom. And we read about the back and forth, and all these other different things in between that happened, with making alliances with daughters, marrying them off, those daughters being murdered, those daughters betraying their fathers. I mean, just really dramatic stuff in the grappling for power of the Middle East. So we're going to pick up here, and it will continue as we will see. Verse 20. Then shall arise in his place one who shall send an exactor of tribute for the glory of the kingdom. But within a few days he shall be broken, neither in anger nor in battle. In his place shall arise a contemptible person to whom royal majesty has not been given. He shall come in without warning and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. So we'll stop there. So in these verses here, the contemptible person is Antiochus Epiphanes, 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 right? That is who they are talking about. So in verse 21, we read, "In his place shall arise a contemptible person to whom royal majesty has not been given. He shall come in without warning and obtain kingdoms by flattery." So he got the throne by treachery, through murder, a series of murder and deceit and some other power brokering, essentially. He became the king, even though he wasn't the rightful heir to the throne. Picking up in verse 22 through 25, "Armies shall be utterly swept away before him and broken, even the prince of the covenant. And from the time that an alliance is made with him, he shall act deceitfully and shall become strong with a small people. Without warning, he shall come into the richest parts of the province, and he shall do what neither his fathers nor his fathers' fathers have done, scattering among them plunder, spoil, and goods. He shall devise plans against strongholds, but only for a time. And he shall stir up his power in the heart against the king of the south with a great army, and the king of the south shall wage war with an exceedingly great and mighty army, but he shall not stand, for plots shall be devised against him." So Antiochus E, the gentleman we're currently talking about, the contemptible person, he finally conquered Egypt. He conquered it, a huge part of their land. He befriended Rome in the process, so this man appears to be pretty politically astute. He knew how to make alliances, he knew how to power broker, he knew how to become friends with the right people, which is usually a telltale trait of people who can tend to be deceptive, especially he's doing this maliciously and intentionally. What he did was he captured the king of the south, the Egyptian king at the time, which was Ptolemy. I think it was the 4th. I can't remember which one it was. They have a huge procession of 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th. I think he went all the way up to 6th or 7th by the end. So what he did was he conquered a huge part of Egypt, captured several cities, captured the king in the process, befriended Rome, because Rome was Egypt's ally, but Rome had other stuff going on, so they didn't come to the aid of Egypt, from what I remember reading. And he set this king up as a puppet king, as a fiat king. Essentially, he was there by name, so as not to upset Rome, because Rome was still allies with them, yet our buddy, our contemptible person of the north, pulled the strings. He controlled everything that happened in Egypt. And in doing so, he finally accomplished what no one in the north had done before, which was finally gaining control of the southern kingdom. But we will see that this did not last for long. Verse 26. Even those who eat his food shall break him. His army shall be swept away, and many shall fall down slain. That's still talking about the king of the south that we were talking about that got defeated, because again, he was betrayed by treachery. Here I do have the note that it was Ptolemy the sixth, who was the son of Cleopatra, which was the woman who was married off the last time we talked to create the alliance and to give her father, who was the king of the north at that time, power, but she betrayed her father and stood with her husband instead, which foiled all of his plans. So we see, again, we're seeing this like family, right? This family like ridiculousness. It's crazy. And then under the guise of friendship, as we'll read here in verse 27, these two kings continually jockeyed for power. They pretended to befriend each other after he was set up, and really they really were trying to get one up on the other person the whole time. You know, sort of like what you see in a modern day soap opera, right? Oh, I'm your best friend. I'm going to plan her murder. Ha 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 ha. Right? So that type of really maniacal stuff, and I almost imagine it in that dramatic fashion, because that's, I mean, we're just looking at a high level overview here, right? And it's dramatic. History's dramatic. And what I have to focus on too is throughout all these hustling, bustlings, and jockeying of mankind trying to gain power and their lust for power, their worship of power, their deceit, their evil, right? And all these people must have been suffering. Think about all the soldiers, the common people who died with to fuel this family feud. This family feud was fueled by the blood of their subjects. You know, these wars were fought on the backs of their people. And as they marched north and south, those lands suffered the consequences as well. But even in all of that, God was working. God's hand was moving. God was guiding this. He had ordained it, because if he did not want it to come to pass, he would not have allowed it to come to pass. Am I saying that he caused it to happen? No. God doesn't cause sin. I mean, frankly, if we're honest with each other, all he has to simply do is not stop us from sinning, because we're all inclined to do it. I will sin on my own without any help. I don't need help to sin. I don't need help to be wicked. I don't need help to have envy and to be covetous of my neighbor. I don't. I will do it on my own without much encouragement. And that's what happened here. God simply allowed it. He did not restrain it from happening. He allowed man to be man and do what man does. But he did it for the glory of his name, because in the end, it leads to something very powerful. Even today, right? It's having this effect where today, in the year 2021, we're looking back 2,000, 2,200, 2,400 years ago, and we're seeing how God's prophet was told by God that these things would happen. And then it was confirmed that it did happen. We see it in history, and we can take heart in that, knowing that God fulfills what he says he's going to do. He doesn't lie. He doesn't balk, right? So even today, we see that he's working through this tragedy. And there are tons of other things that come out of this, including the eventual conquering of these lands by the Roman Empire, because they were weakened so much by these constant wars. They were weakened so much by this constant warring over hundreds of years that eventually the Roman Empire just comes in and conquers them and builds roads. And then on the day of Pentecost, those roads were traveled. All the people came to Israel, came to Jerusalem, all the Jews that were spread out all across the land from these constant wars, from the exile period. All these Jews came back speaking all different languages to celebrate a religious festival. And on the day of Pentecost, God blessed and baptized the apostles with the Holy Spirit, gave them the ability to speak in foreign languages that all those people from all those different lands spread across all the known world understood. Preached to them the gospel of Jesus. Bring thousands of them to God to bow the knee to Christ. And then they all went back on these Roman roads to their home nations in their own languages, speaking to their own communities and proclaiming the gospel. Do you think that Daniel saw that coming? No. But God knew what he was doing the whole time. And his hand was working to allow men and working through men to fulfill his great purpose that none of us would have, no one could see that coming. But if it wasn't for these kingdoms battling each other to be weakened, to be conquered by the Romans, to build roads for this to happen. You can't plan that. No person can plan that. So let's pick up. We'll power through the rest of this. It's just, I get excited about this stuff, man. This is great. This is powerful. So picking up, I believe we are in verse 27, and let's find that here. And as for the two kings, their hearts shall be bent on doing evil. They shall speak lies at the same table, but to no avail, for the end is yet to be at the time appointed. So again, that's where we see that these two kings, north and south, would eat at the same table, inferring friendship, and they would speak lies to each other. That is the deceit that they were trying to jockey for power, which we know from history that is exactly what happened. Verse 28, and he shall return to his land with great wealth, but his heart shall be set against the holy covenant, and he shall work his will and return to his whole own land. So this is where on the return from Egypt, he attacked Jerusalem. Our contemptible person, Mr. Antiochus Epiphanes. When he attacked Jerusalem and marched through Judea, he killed 80,000 Israelites. He took into slavery 40,000 Israelites, and he sold to others. He sold into slavery to other people and nations another 40,000 Israelites. So grand total there, I can do this math because it's basic addition. We have 160,000 Israelites. Which, if we're familiar with the size of just Jerusalem alone, it's less than a square mile. So in comparison, Reading is to Philadelphia in size what Jerusalem is to Reading, if that makes sense. So we can understand sort of how tiny Jerusalem is in comparison to other things, right? There were not that many people probably living inside the city, but in the general area, absolutely. So essentially, he carried off the entire city proper at least, of Jerusalem. Picking up in verse 29, at the time appointed he shall return and come into the south, but it shall not be his time as it was before. Sounds like he's going to have some trouble. So Antiochus again invaded Egypt, but this time, because it was not his time as before, this time it wasn't going to work out for him. This time God had not appointed him to conquer again. Often what would happen is people would conquer a nation, they couldn't stay there, so they'd have them pay tribute, set them up as essentially subservient. They'd have to continually pay tribute and essentially bow the knee to whatever king conquered them. They would leave that land, go back to their home country, and as long as they were receiving tribute and there weren't people being rebellious, they didn't go back. Every once in a while they would, just to check things out, make sure it was good. They'd set up their own, fiat government, their own kings and queens and nobles to sort of look over things for them that they thought they were loyal to them. But they wouldn't sit there and occupy like we do today. For ships of Kittim shall come against him, and he shall be afraid and withdraw, and shall turn back and be enraged, and take action against the holy covenant. He shall turn back and pay attention to those who forsake the holy covenant. So on his way back, he attacked Jerusalem again. But this time, he didn't just attack Jerusalem, he desecrated the holy temple, to the extent of having them sacrifice or trying to have them sacrifice pigs on the altar of the temple. And in which the vast majority, if not all, of the men of the city, the religious men, the higher-ups, refused and were murdered for it. He also institutes laws saying they're not allowed to practice their customs and practice their festivals. They're not allowed to be circumcised either. So we see how this is an immense persecution. Now he was, verse 32 we read, he shall seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant, but people who know their God shall stand firm and take action. So he was helped by apostate Jews who had turned away from the faith. They were what's called Hellenized. So Hellenistic Greece, right? We've heard Hellenistic Greek. It's one of the languages, I believe, one of the Greek languages, dialects. It means to become Greek. So somebody today may be from another country, but they become Americanized. So I knew a girl that was first generation Palestinian American, right? Her parents were from Palestine, like straight up plucked out of Palestine, plopped here in America on their own accord. You would not be able to tell this girl had not spent her whole life in America. She was extremely Americanized, right? So it's that same concept. She's very Americanized Palestinian. There's not much left of the original culture. She's absorbed into the culture today, into our national culture. So a Hellenized Jew was someone who had pretty much turned away from all their Israelite culture, all their heritage, all their obedience to God, and were living as essentially a pagan in Greek culture as a Greek as much as they could. So he was helped by those people to do this. But in the end, those people were rebuked by God. So in verse 32 through 34 we read, he shall seduce with flattery with those who violate the covenant, but the people who know their God shall stand firm and take action, and the wise among the people shall make many understand, though for some days they shall stumble by sword and flame, by captivity and plunder. When they stumble, they shall receive a little help, and many shall join themselves to them with flattery. And some of the wise shall stumble, so that they may be refined, purified, and made white until the time of the end, for it still awaits the appointed time. For it still awaits the appointed time. So, near the end of all this, you had the Maccabean Revolt. There was a high priest who went through this, who experienced this persecution of Israel, of the Jews, pretty much fled. Him and his son, he raised his sons up to be high priests, to be priests of the covenant of Israel. And they went around and they led a revolt against the Greeks, against the Northern Syrian Empire. Eventually, our friend, the northern king at the time, came back and tried to reconquer Israel, and they killed the leader, Judah Maccabee. However, his sons, who were raised up to be obedient to God, continued to fight, continued to revolt, won a bunch of notable battles, very outnumbered through guerrilla-style tactics. And they actually won the independence of Israel and Jerusalem and the surrounding areas from the northern king who had conquered them at this point. In the process of doing this, they slaughtered the Hellenized Jews, the apostate Jews. And that's where it says they will be for a short time, and then they will stumble, they'll be laid down. Because the ones who had turned their back on the covenant and forsaken God, were cut down by God in the end. Because he empowered these men to preserve his faith. The same as he empowered the few saints throughout the Dark Ages, where the common man wasn't allowed to have a Bible, and preserved his faith. The way he empowered Martin Luther to protest the corruption of the Holy Roman Empire, and bring about the Protestant faith, in the same way that he will today empower men to preserve his true faith when there is a ton of apostasy at large in the church, when there is a ton of false teaching, when there's a ton of bowing the knee to men, bowing the knee to culture, and wanting to assimilate into the culture instead of showing the culture where it should be. Again, God will not fail. We know this because this short passage alone, right? It's not that short. We've been in it for 2 days, right? But we know this because here he has shown us his divine hand in this. We have the benefit of looking back and being able to see Monday morning quarterbacking all of this and seeing him work. How can we not have faith in that? And as we go forward here and we see that there is this horrible ideas in the church, this bowing the knee to culture instead of to Christ, this giving in to the desires of the flesh instead of giving our flesh up for Christ. And I'm not talking about us. This is a royal we as the culture at large. Because when God passes judgment on an apostate nation, the Christians in that nation will suffer too. They'll suffer because the nation is suffering, because you're part of that nation. God's not passing judgment on the Christians. He will provide for them. He'll give them provision that they need. But still, when bad things happen, it happens to the community. And we see that here. But what did God do? He provided for his faithful, loyal servants. He strengthened the ones who stayed true to him. He raised them up and used them to turn an apostate nation at this point, because Israel's culture was all but destroyed and decimated. If it wasn't for this Maccabean family, essentially, of priests, who eventually became generals and leaders, they would have disappeared under that constant trotting back and forth of a half a millennia of warfare of a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. But God preserved his people. He preserved his people. He preserved his law. He preserved his ordinances. He preserved his way. And he brought it to flourish right on time. And maybe we struggle sometimes. Maybe there's a constant warfare in our lives, a back and forth, and we're just beat down by the billows and the waves like we read about in Jonah. Turn your hearts to God. Keep your faces toward God. Bow the knee to God, not to the world, not to the flesh, not to the devil. Because he will preserve you. And he will bring up in you and make you flourish for his good purpose, for his own pleasure. And he will use you as men, like he used this family, the Maccabees, the loyal servants of God, to take his word forth and to redeem his holy people. Not to redeem in that sense. Jesus redeems us. But to bring that back, to preach it to the culture at large. A culture at this point was completely apostatized. We're not there yet. But he's calling on us to do this, to proclaim his gospel, proclaim his ways. There is forgiveness in Christ for everyone, no matter what you've done. There's forgiveness. Bow the knee to God. He will pour it out on you abundantly. Seek that forgiveness because it's already been done. It is finished. And turn away from the ways of this world. Turn to God's ways. And then take that way to the world. To let them know that this is good. This is holy. And this is a pleasing aroma to God. We must do these things. It's not an option. When God said, go forth, subdue and rule, it was not a suggestion. It was a command. And that's what we need to do. The reason I said I was going to cut it off here around verse 35 is because verse 36 to 45, there is no defined historical context for what comes next. There is a lot of different thoughts. No one is able to confidently say beyond a reasonable doubt this is this. There are some people who believe it is about the Roman Empire. There are some people who believe it spans the time from the advent of Christ all the way through the end of times. There's some people who believe it talks about Antichrist. There are some people who believe that it is talking about the king of the north and the Maccabean revolt. But no one is able to say beyond a reasonable doubt exactly what it is. And therefore, most commentators that I have read have all deferred, saying that it could be any one of these things. And we can't line it up the way we can line up this other stuff. So therefore, it may be, as we find in the book of Revelation, as we find in the book of Matthew, it may be prophecy that has been partially fulfilled, but yet also partially to come. Now, when I threw that word partial preterist out there earlier, that's exactly what that means. Historically, most of it's been fulfilled. However, there is still yet some to come of this prophecy has not been fulfilled. And that's what we find here by and large. So I will read through these last 9 verses, and we will get our prayer on. Picking up in verse 36. And the king shall do as he wills. He shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak astonishing things against the God, that's big G, of gods, little g. He shall prosper till the indignation is accomplished. For what is decreed shall be done. He shall pay no attention to the gods of his father, or to the one beloved by women. He shall not pay attention to any other god, for he shall magnify himself above all. He shall honor the God of the fortress instead of these, a God whom his fathers did not know, and he shall honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and costly gifts. He shall deal with the strongest fortress with the help of a foreign god. These are all little g gods, by the way. This is not Yahweh. These are little gods. Those who acknowledge him, he shall load with honor. He shall make them rulers over many, and shall divide the land for a price. At the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him, but the king of the north shall rush upon him like a whirlwind, with chariots and horsemen, and with many ships. And he shall come into countries, and shall overflow and pass through. He shall come into the glorious land, and tens of thousands shall flee, but these shall be delivered out of his hand, Edom and Moab, and the main part of the Ammonites. He shall stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. He shall become ruler of the treasures of gold and of silver, and all the precious things of Egypt. And the Libyans and the Cushites shall follow in his train. But news from the east and the north shall alarm him, and he shall go out with great fury to destroy and devote many to destruction. And he shall pitch his palladial tents between the sea and the glorious holy mountain, yet he shall come to his end with none to help him. So here we have a very doom and gloom situation, but again, God says he will come to his end. And although we don't know exactly what this is about, some other scholars believe this also could be hints of the Maccabean invasion of the Holy Land and conquering what we call today Muslims. They were originally called Mohammedans or Saracens, or the tribe of Muhammad that he conquered the world and his descendants conquered the world with. But yet he shall come to his end, and no one shall help him. That's reassuring to me. Because whatever it's talking about, we know that all these little gods do not give power. Only our God, with a big G, Yahweh, does. And we know that whatever evil may come forth from these false gods and from these men that worship them will come to an end. It will come to an end. Whatever persecution, whatever suffering will come to an end. And sometimes if things are really bad where we look around the world, remember that. It will come to an end. And New Jerusalem will come down with a new heaven and a new earth. Christ's reign will be forever. We'll be forever in the presence of a holy, powerful, and just God. There will be no death and no suffering. It will be the Garden of Eden restored to us. And we will all live abundantly and forever in it with that God. And that is a promise worth holding on to right there. That it will come to an end. So, who has any prayer requests?